If you think pain decides when a soldier stops fighting, then you haven't met a human yet, and what you're about to hear is the kind of story that makes entire alien medical doctrines get rewritten from the ground up. So if you enjoy HFY stories where humans prove that survival is more than biology, make sure you subscribe to the channel, Coming the HFY. Because this one isn't about winning a battle. It's about refusing to lose, even when your own body says you should. The first thing Senior Medic Thalen Ricks noticed wasn't the injury, it was the contradiction, because according to every reading on his advanced triage scanner, the human lying on the reinforced med table should have been unconscious at best and non-responsive at worst, but instead Corporal Marcus Hale was fully awake, slightly propped up on one elbow, looking down at his own chest like he was inspecting damage to a piece of equipment rather than his own body, and the scanner didn't like that at all. It chirped, recalibrated, then displayed a cascade of warnings that didn't align with the subject's behavior: severe plasma trauma across the upper torso, multiple penetration wounds along the flank consistent with high-velocity fragmentation, skeletal stress fractures across the rib structure, internal bruising bordering on critical thresholds, and yet the patient's vital signs, while elevated, remained stable. His breathing controlled, his focus sharp, and his first question wasn't about survival or pain management but about timelines, specifically how long until he could get back to his unit. And Thalen paused because in Delphian medical protocol there was a clear sequence to everything: stabilize, treat, monitor, rehabilitate, and only then consider reintegration into active duty. Deviation from that process wasn't just discouraged, it was considered reckless. And yet here was a patient who seemed to have skipped several steps entirely in his own mind. So Thalen answered carefully, explaining that the injuries were significant, life-threatening under standard assessment models, requiring extended recovery, and Marcus nodded like he was hearing a weather report, acknowledging the severity without letting it influence the outcome he had already decided on. And when he asked again, more directly, whether the medic could patch him up enough for field mobility, not full recovery, just enough to function, Thalen felt something shift in his usual approach, because the question itself reframed the situation. It wasn't about healing in the traditional sense, it was about capability. And that distinction mattered more than any single data point, so he ran the analysis again, not asking how long until the body was fully restored, but how long until it could operate under controlled stress without catastrophic failure. And the results were unconventional. The plasma damage, while severe, was localized. The fragmentation wounds had avoided critical organs by narrow margins. The rib fractures limited movement but did not eliminate it, and most importantly, the patient's neurological and psychological state indicated a level of control over pain response that reduced functional impairment significantly, which forced Thalen to confront something he had only encountered in theoretical studies, that for humans, recovery was not purely a passive biological process but an active decision layered on top of it, and that decision could alter outcomes in ways standard models failed to predict. So he adjusted his plan, not abandoning protocol but bending it within acceptable limits, initiating accelerated stabilization procedures, reinforcing damaged tissue with regenerative compounds optimized for rapid integration rather than long-term perfection, aligning skeletal fractures with flexible support structures that allowed partial mobility instead of complete immobilization. And throughout the entire process Marcus remained conscious, not because anesthesia wasn't available but because he had declined full sedation, opting instead for localized suppression that allowed him to stay aware, to monitor, to participate, and that alone unsettled Thalen more than any scanner reading, because it suggested a level of tolerance and control that bordered on the absurd, and at regular intervals he checked vitals, expecting to see spikes, instability, signs that the body was reaching its limits, but each time the readings came back within operational margins. Strained but holding, like a system running at the edge of capacity without failing. And when the procedures were complete and the immediate risk stabilized, Thalen gave his estimate, hesitant at first because it contradicted everything he had been trained to say, but grounded in the data he couldn't ignore, that with strict adherence to movement limitations and continued monitoring, the human could achieve functional mobility within 72 hours, not optimal, not safe by traditional standards, but possible. And Marcus accepted that timeline without hesitation, as if it had been the answer he expected all along. And over the next 2 days Thalen observed something that would later become a case study across multiple medical divisions, because the recovery process didn't follow the usual pattern of gradual improvement under enforced rest. Instead it became an active collaboration between treatment and willpower. The human followed every instruction precisely, performing controlled movements that pushed right up to the edge of what the supports could handle without exceeding them, maintaining wound care with meticulous attention, adjusting his own behavior based on feedback from both the medic and his own perception of his limits, and it became clear that he wasn't ignoring the pain, he was managing it, compartmentalizing it, using it as data rather than allowing it to dictate his actions, and that distinction was something Thalen had never seen applied so effectively in practice, because in most species pain served as a hard stop, a signal to cease activity and prevent further damage, but in humans it appeared to function more like a variable input, something to be accounted for but not necessarily obeyed. And by the end of the second day Marcus requested reassessment, not out of impatience, but with a clear understanding of his own condition, and when Thalen ran the diagnostics again the results confirmed what observation had already suggested: structural stability within acceptable limits, mobility restricted but sufficient, risk factors present but manageable, and after a long moment of consideration he approved the clearance, stating it almost as a confirmation of an outcome that had been inevitable from the moment the patient first asked the question. And as Marcus left the medical bay to rejoin his unit, moving carefully but confidently, Thalen remained behind, staring at the data that no longer fit neatly within the frameworks he had relied on, and in the hours that followed he began updating his records, not with dramatic conclusions but with precise adjustments, annotations that would later influence how entire medical teams approached human patients, noting that standard injury classifications did not reliably predict functional capability in humans, that behavioral indicators must be evaluated alongside physiological data, and that pain tolerance in humans was not a fixed threshold but a dynamic variable influenced by psychological factors, training, and intent. And he added one final note, something less clinical but no less important, that for humans the question of recovery was not always, when is the body healed, but often, when is the individual ready, and that readiness could precede full biological restoration by a significant margin. And if you've made it this far, then you already understand why that matters, because in a universe where most species wait for their bodies to tell them when to stop, humans have a habit of deciding for themselves when they're not done yet. So don't forget to subscribe to Coming the HFY for more stories like this, because sometimes the most dangerous thing on the battlefield isn't a weapon. It's a human who refuses to stay down even when everything says they should.